Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler, author of A Saga on Home Video, a fan's guide to U.S. Star Wars home video releases, which you can find on Amazon right now. This actually is going to start delving into a topic, that is, this episode, is going to start delving into a topic that really, it's kind of weird in that I'm not sure it's going to be appropriate for future versions of this book. I try to focus in this book on the official Star Wars releases. But I do mention at a point late in the book about how there are other things out there that you might choose to collect that aren't necessarily covered by that book or in many Star Wars fans' collections. Things like parodies, and that's why we turned and looked at things like Spaceballs a while back. Or things like fan-made documentaries or fan-made parodies that are released legally but which don't have any kind of official stamp of approval from Lucasfilm, Disney at this point, 20th Century Fox, or anybody else who was involved behind the scenes as far as license rights and things like that. And I've sort of shied away from that as far as covering those materials on the show, but they've been in my collection, and in some cases I've now expanded to get even more of that type of thing for my collection as my U.S. collecting has started to narrow down to very little left to find. So we're going to start in this episode looking at Star Wars fan-made documentaries that have had retail releases. Some of these are going to be a little bit obscure, so in talking about them, I'm going to give you at least a little bit of sense of my opinion on it. But they're certainly out there and available if you want to pick them up. The first one we're going to look at is one that I've been asked a lot about over the years. I'm not sure why. I guess it just happens to be a fairly prominent one, I suppose. And one that you could imagine seeing a modern version of in 2017, 2018, perhaps to tear apart Rian Johnson over the controversy relating to The Last Jedi. And that is the rather provocatively named The People versus George Lucas. Okay, this is a DVD release of a fan documentary from 2010. People versus George Lucas. You have the filed March 13th, the kind of filed stamp that you would have on a legal concern. We have different quotes there. Fast, witty, and imaginative from Marshall Fine of the Huffington Post. The best film I've seen about geek culture ever, Chris Gore of G4. Does G4 still exist? Then we have our quote down there at the bottom as well. You don't have to be a Star Wars nut to enjoy this fast-paced film. Gary Goldstein, Los Angeles Times. And then we have basically a couple of fans in exasperation with Lucas, and a stylized version of Lucas there with the kind of hand gesture going on. On the side, we have a recreation of that cover art. We have the logo, People vs. George Lucas. Down here we have closed caption, DVD, and Lionsgate. Yes, it did get a release through the distributor Lionsgate, best known for things like, I don't know, the Saw franchise, which is actually one of my favorite franchises out there. But no, you won't be seeing it from the Saw home video library series or anything like that anytime soon. Or ever. I say anytime soon, somebody's going to say, oh, it's coming, just not soon. No, never. I love those films, but no, I'm not doing shows on them. And then we have the back, which gives quite a bit of information. Kind of nicely stylized there, along with its awards and whatnot. So to be fair, let's run through it. We have, of course, the proof of purchase type thing, the little UPC symbol and proof of purchase. And then it says, to give you the sense of what this documentary is about, the passion the original Star Wars trilogy inspires in its fans is unparalleled. But when it comes to George Lucas himself, many have found their ardor has cooled into a complicated love-hate relationship. This hilarious, heartfelt documentary delves deep into Lucas's cultural legacy, utilizing interviews taken from over 600 hours of footage, and peppered with extraordinary Star Wars and Indiana Jones recreations lovingly immortalized in song, needlepoint, Lego, claymation, puppets, and papier-mâché. Above all, this film asks the question, who truly owns that galaxy far, far away? The man who created it, or the fans that worship it? Spoiler, I can answer that question. Who owns it? Whoever owns the license, whoever owns the copyright, whoever owns the franchise. Lucas, prior to the deal with Disney, now Disney. Who owns it? They did or do. There's a whole debate going on in culture right now about this idea of if a franchise or a story becomes so beloved by the people that it's taken on as almost a part of pop culture, part of the essence of a culture's pop cultural reference repertoire and so forth, does it then become essentially the property of everyone? And the owners are the fans that are trying to guide it. No. The consensus has been no. You see that happening from a cultural standpoint, a sociological, psychological standpoint, but from a legal standpoint, from a creative standpoint, no. That only happens once you see something hit the public domain where it doesn't have someone actively controlling it at that time. Like, say, with Sherlock Holmes and how now you have all these different spin-offs and versions of trying to tell Sherlock Holmes stories. Why? Because there isn't a controlling entity. It entered the public domain and then became something anybody could play with. But aside from that, putting that aside, because that is one of my pet peeves, not about the film, but just that concept in general here, we then also have special features listed. We have a filmmaker commentary, which is kind of interesting. The People vs. Star Wars 3D. Tell you what, I'll talk about that in a minute. The People vs. Star Wars 3D music video of a song called George Lucas Raped My Childhood, or Our Childhood. Poetry Slam selections, and Gary Kurt's interview. And then underneath, I note it's a widescreen presentation. English 5.1 Dolby Digital Audio, English and Spanish subtitles. It was an official selection for the Los Angeles Film Festival in 2010. Official selection for the AFI Discovery Channel Silver Docs Documentary Festival in 2010. And the official selection for the Edinburgh International Film Festival in 2010. And it is 16 by 9 widescreen, so it is actually going to work well on a typical modern television, even if it's not HD. Runs about 133 minutes. The disc itself, pretty much bare bones, what you would see from Lionsgate and other companies at times. Just the title there, DVD symbol, Dolby Digital, Quark Films, a little teeny tiny Exhibit A picture symbol, Lionsgate, and then your legalese running along the edge. The gist of this is basically complaints that fans have with Lucas, really starting with the special editions and running up through the creation of the prequels. This, of course, predates anything happening with Disney acquisition and that sort of thing. It's just focused on Lucas himself. And it spends a little bit of time building him up as this great filmmaker, and then spends most of the time ripping him to pieces and mocking decisions that he's made. Again, going back to the whole George Lucas raped my childhood being a recurring motif in the discussion in the film, though at least they're referencing where it came from, which was, of course, the episode of South Park that had something similar happening with Indiana Jones, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg. If you haven't seen it, watch it at your peril, but it's an interesting episode in terms of pop culture satire. But what I find is that it really does sort of live up to its name in that this is the prosecution of Lucas for creative differences and such, basically, without much in the way of actually trying to defend him. It's not a balanced take at all. It's about 2/3 or 3/4 scathing criticism of Lucas, and then every so often, maybe about 1/3 or 1/4, people coming out and giving some reason for why he did what he did, or defending what he did, or saying something as innocuous as, well, yeah, he did this, but what he didn't understand was, and kind of explaining away why Lucas may have been somewhat tone-deaf to how fans would react to certain things like the special editions or Jar Jar or whatever. One of its special features takes the time to then interview Star Wars fans about the upcoming Phantom Menace 3D release at the time that had recently been announced, where they basically just bitch about it the entire time and how almost everybody says either, I'm going to go see it because I see everything Star Wars, I don't care whether I don't like it or not, or it's people saying that it shouldn't have been done and it's a travesty, etc., etc., etc. So if you are someone who tends to have a lot of pent-up anger towards Lucas, this would be a good one to watch because you're going to find a lot of like-minded people. If you are someone who is the opposite, who tends to think Lucas can do no wrong and sees no way that anyone could be critical of him, this is also a good one to watch because it gives you the other side of that coin of people who actually are very critical of Lucas. And to their credit, at the end of it, they do essentially say thank you to Lucas and express how they love it. It's very much like the sentiment, at least at the very, very end, that I express in my afterword for A More Civilized Age, the third of those Sequart anthologies, in my essay, Finding Our Lack of Blind Faith Refreshing, where it talks about how a love of the saga does entail criticism, because we are going to pick it apart and look at the nuances of it and so forth. That just like family members who want to try to get someone who is addicted to drugs onto a treatment plan as an intervention, it's about love, not about hate. very much the same thought can be done towards fandom criticisms. I don't want to necessarily say that this is bad to watch. I actually think it was very interesting to watch, but it is not a balanced take. Watching this gives you a deluge of opinions against Lucas, very much like you would be able to say that you're looking at bias when you're watching, say, Fox News that's very pro-Trump, or you're watching, say, MSNBC that's very anti-Trump. If you know what you're getting into in terms of which you're watching and what slant they're going with, which this title makes perfectly clear, then yeah, it should be an interesting watch for you. I would say, though, if you're looking for a more balanced take on the same type of thing, you might also want to check this out that came out a few years ago. I've got nothing to do with this one. I just really enjoyed it. It's a completely unauthorized from Smart Pop, Star Wars on Trial. Science fiction and fantasy writers debate the most popular science fiction films of all time. It's for the prosecution, David Brin, and for the defense, Matthew Woodring Stover, the person who wrote the Revenge of the Sith novelization that I used to dub that phrase Stover effect in years past by the podcast that I'm involved with, to refer to when you read something that's a supplemental thing or an adaptation to a film or some other media that enhances your experience of that actual media by association, like the extra depth given to the characters and situations for Revenge of the Sith in the novelization, enhancing my enjoyment of that film. But basically, this is set up as different charges, and each charge has some prosecution and defense essays in it. So, for instance, charge number, 2. While claiming mythic significance, Star Wars portrays no admirable religious or ethical beliefs. For the prosecution is an essay by John C. Wright. For the defense, an essay by John Lynch. And there are a total of 8 charges along with opening and closing statements by the 2 people mentioned on the cover. I found this very interesting because it's trying to give a balanced take on those charges. This does not. Still interesting, but understand they are very different takes on the same idea of, hey, we've got criticisms, we want to air them for the public to then decide. This is one, again, I've been asked about quite a bit. This is where they talk about, among other things, the creation of the special editions, and they do make reference to the whole destruction of original negatives in order to make the new stuff. So it's cited oftentimes. Perhaps that's why I'm asked about it more often. But it is available at retail. I got my copy, I believe, on Amazon. So fairly easy to get a hold of. So if you're looking for The People vs. George Lucas, it is out there on DVD and now part of my Star Wars home video library. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers. Or should I say, court is adjourned! You'll have to decide the verdict for yourself after watching.